Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. In January of 2021, when Ritchie Torres first began serving in Congress, he was greeted a few days later by an attack on the Capitol. This past November, he was reelected to serve New York's 15th Congressional District, and he was greeted this time by an absurd spectacle of the Republican Party needing 15 different votes to elect a speaker to lead the House of Representatives. It's been an interesting ride, to say the least, and tonight he joins us from Washington, D.C. to provide an update on what he has seen and how he views his sophomore term representing the Bronx in Congress. It's my pleasure to welcome back to Bronx Talk Representative Ritchie Torres. Congressman, nice to see you and nice to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's just get right to it. What are your impressions of the protracted votes that were needed to elect a Speaker of the House of Representatives?
Well, the Speaker's vote has shown the House Republicans to be embarrassingly dysfunctional. Not in 164 years has it taken the House of Representatives so long to select a Speaker. And if Republicans cannot perform the basic function of selecting a Speaker within a reasonable time frame, then it raises serious questions about their ability to govern. I'm concerned that Kevin McCarthy has essentially surrendered his speakership to the far right of the Republican Party. And as we saw during the psychodrama surrounding the Speaker's vote, the far right consists of arsonists who are intent on burning everything down, including the leadership of their own party and the full faith and credit of the United States. So I'm concerned about what the dysfunction of the Speaker's vote will mean for the future of our country.
In some ways, maybe it unified them because now they say, okay, we got together. I mean, this is the line that they're pushing. We've gotten together. We finally reached agreement, and now we're unified and have momentum, and we're going to do all the things that we want to do. And so certainly they would dispute your point of view that they're going to be dysfunctional because they've basically laid out an agenda now, which we're starting to see, of things that they want to do.
Well, the House rules, the concessions that Kevin McCarthy made to the Freedom Caucus, to the far right caucus, will perpetuate the same disorder, division, and dysfunction that nearly devoured Kevin McCarthy's candidacy for Speaker. So Kevin McCarthy agreed to a rule that would enable a single House Republican to file what is known as a motion to vacate, to set in motion a no confidence vote against him. So Kevin McCarthy, how can he possibly govern effectively as Speaker if he is removable at any moment, at the whim of any person, for any reason, no matter how personal and petty, like the inmates are running the asylum? I mean, he has made the House so dysfunctional as to be ungovernable.
Do you have a sense of what maybe unspoken concessions he might have made? Because what you just mentioned was out there already, and then he needed to do something which is still somewhat unpublicized and unspoken to win over those last couple of votes, or at least get them to somewhat compromise so that he could be elected Speaker. Is there some general knowledge or even whispering around the halls about what he might have given away, if anything?
There's concern that the concessions that Kevin McCarthy made to the far right will heighten the risk of a debt default, which would derail the full faith and credit of the United States and with it the American economy. There's concern that it will heighten the risk of a government shutdown, which would do real damage to the American economy. So those are some of the concerns that are circulating in the wake of the Speaker vote.
I'm just curious because we all watched it on TV. I mean, I didn't watch every vote because you could sit there forever watching the same thing. What was the dialogue like on the Democrat side of the House while this was going on? Was there talk about football scores, or were you discussing what was going on in the other aisle? Were you simply, guffawing and laughing at the spectacle that was going on across the aisle? Just a little inside baseball, if you will, of what you and your colleagues were doing, because you folks were ready to stay there all night, every night, to kind of watch this thing play out. What was going on over there?
Well, for us, the House Republican drama was both comedy and tragedy. It was comedic because the Republicans were making an absurdity of themselves, but it was tragic because their dysfunction is destructive to Congress as an institution, it's destructive to the country, and it will cripple our ability to solve problems. I mean, we're replacing the substantive governing of House Democrats with the performative and vindictive and self-destructive grandstanding of House Republicans. And what was particularly striking was the contrast between the unity of House Democrats around Hakeem Jeffries and the disunity and dysfunction and division of House Republicans over Kevin McCarthy, who was essentially being held hostage by the far right of his own party.
I wanted to ask you about this. I was thinking about this. The Democratic Party has a very far left. The progressive DSA members are very far left, and they've disagreed. And some of your colleagues who you know well, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, did not vote in favor of the most recent infrastructure bill. And there are others who did not vote for things that you and other Democrats hold dear. Is there a parallel between the far left and the far right at this particular time?
I see no parallel between the far right and the far left. I see the far right as a uniquely destructive force in American politics. There are no far left equivalent of insurrectionists invading the U.S. Capitol in a violent attempt to overturn the results of a 2020 election. There's no far left equivalent of the obstructionist who brought Congress to a grinding halt for 4 days and 15 rounds of voting. So I see the far right as uniquely dysfunctional and destructive.
Let's talk about some of the rules. The new rules to insist that each bill be reviewed for 72 hours. Many, even on the Democratic side, were not thrilled that the last infrastructure bill was put out just, in the dark of night, and Congress members were expected to vote on it, the next day. Do you like the idea of insisting that things be presented 72 hours in advance? And then, of course, the whole notion of spending bills being individually evaluated so that large bills couldn't contain many things that, let's say, for infrastructure, included funding for Ukraine, those kinds of things. So let's do separately each one. You like the 72-hour bill?
The 72-hour bill is sensible. It's a continuation of a practice that House Democrats began. But it's sensible because it allows members the opportunity to review legislation, and it provides for greater accountability and transparency. So I'm fully supportive of it on the basis of good government. The second question, I suspect you're referencing passing the 12 appropriation bills rather than a single omnibus.
That's right.
It sounds benign on paper, but I would have concerns about it if it complicates the ability to pass a budget. I feel like the highest priority is to pass a budget that will keep government operations funded. It's worth noting that the federal government is about 25% of our economy, and state and local governments depend on the federal government, and government collectively is about a third of our economy. So it's not in our interest to have a government shutdown, and I would worry about rules that raise the risk of a government shutdown.
When I interviewed, it was a little more than a year ago, your colleague, Congressman Jamal Bowman, about raising the debt limit. He said the U.S. can never default on its loans, and he said point blank, yes, we can keep raising the debt limit as we need to. The GOP wants to cap the debt ceiling. What's your perspective on government spending at this point? Do we need to rein it in? There are so many needs. I mean, goodness gracious, we could spend here all day talking about the need. But at what point, or is there a point that you have to say, you know what, we got to put a ceiling on this. We can't keep doing what we've been doing.
Well, keep in mind that the debt ceiling is about spending in the past rather than spending in the future. So there's nothing remotely fiscally conservative or fiscally responsible about breaching the debt limit. It is fiscally irresponsible to default on your debt, to default on your debt obligations. So whatever discussion there is to be had about spending should be kept separate from the debt limit. Like, we have an obligation to honor and protect the full faith and credit of the United States and to fulfill our debt obligations. Because if we were to do otherwise, it would do irreparable damage to the American economy.
I want to just bring up a Bronx issue that you have wholeheartedly supported in conjunction with Senator Schumer, and that is the idea of capping the cross Bronx. I've seen some numbers. It seems to me, I mean, like the project or not, if you're going to do it, it's going to cost a lot of money. Is that the kind of thing that you say, look, this has to be done, quote unquote, regardless of what it costs? I mean, how do you view a project like that in light of getting it allocated, getting the funding allocated, and working to make it happen?
Well, for me, capping the cross Bronx is about both public health and environmental justice. So every day to and from the Hunts Point Terminal Market, there are about 15,000 diesel truck trips. And those diesel trucks, as well as tens of thousands of more, create massive congestion on the cross Bronx that unleash massive amounts of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And so if you're a young kid in the Bronx who lives near the cross Bronx, who attends school nearby, you are breathing, through no fault of your own, pollutants that cause you to have respiratory diseases like asthma. It's no accident that the Bronx, the South Bronx, has the highest rates of asthma hospitalization in the country. That's not an accident, that's a consequence of the Cross Bronx Expressway, which to me is both literally and metaphorically a structure of racism, environmental racism. And so if we were to cap the Cross Bronx Expressway and install what are known as electrostatic filters that would prevent the air pollutants from recirculating in the air, we would have a game-changing impact in improving the public health of the Bronx. The difference in life expectancy between the South Bronx and the Upper East Side of Manhattan can be as much as 10 years. And capping the Cross Bronx would bring us as close as we've ever been to closing that public health gap, that life expectancy gap. So for me, the public health of the Bronx is worth the cost. And keep in mind that we are proposing capping the Cross Bronx. And capping a highway is much more cost effective than digging a highway, which is a much more intensive and expensive undertaking.
When the Republicans finally elected a speaker and got control, they have laid out an agenda that, frankly, starts with investigations. They're putting together a series of investigations that they claim to be pursuing, and they're setting up a variety of committees and subcommittees. Here's a list that the New York Times put out just yesterday. They want to talk about the weaponization of government, investigate the Biden family business, investigate the origins of the COVID pandemic, investigate China competitiveness, investigate the withdrawal from Afghanistan, investigate border enforcement, investigate treatment of January 6 defendants. It occurred to me that you were the chair of the councils, the city councils, when you were in the city council, oversight and investigations committee. So you have considerable experience with governmental investigations. Is this a good use of their authority now that the GOP controls the House? They have concerns. They said, let's investigate these things.
It depends on the nature of the investigation and the person chairing the investigation. So it is fair game, for example, to investigate the withdrawal from Afghanistan. That's a legitimate subject of congressional oversight, whereas the Committee on Weaponization is pure political theater and it's a waste of public resources. So the answer to your question varies depending on the nature of the investigation and who ultimately is selected as the chair of the committee conducting the investigation. But keep in mind that Republicans claim to decry the weaponization of government, yet the Republicans passed a rule known as the Holman Rule that would enable the federal government to be weaponized against particular individuals in the federal government. The rule could, in theory, allow House Republicans to defund the salary of Secretary Mayorkas because of disagreements over immigration policy. So for me, the Republican rules package is pure hypocrisy. Republicans have rules that would enable them to zero out funding for a criminal investigation into Donald Trump. The new rules defund the Office of Congressional Ethics. The new rules would enable a House Republican like Scott Perry, who's being investigated by the FBI, to investigate the investigators investigating him. So much for training the swamp.
Yeah, that doesn't work. I have to tell you that a lot of the fist banging during the dialogue over electing a speaker over we can't keep spending and we can't keep raising the debt limit when, of course, the Trump taxes were clearly responsible for raising the debt limit in historical forms.
So historically, we've had a rule known as pay-go, pay as you go. And pay-go promotes fiscal responsibility because it requires both spending and tax cuts to be deficit neutral. And if you have new spending and new tax cuts, you need to find revenues that offset the impact of the spending. Republicans are proposing to replace pay-go with cut-go, cut as you go. And the Republican cut-go rule prohibits spending even if the spending is deficit neutral, while permitting tax cuts even if the tax cuts are deficit financed. So there's a double standard that discriminates against public investments in American families and working people and discriminates in favor of massive tax cuts for the wealthiest corporations and individuals.
I have some other questions about some of these investigations, but just based on your answer there, what you've presented sounds reasonable to me. What do you do as a congressman who's passionate about his work, who's passionate about his district, who's passionate about the United States of America? What do you do at this point? You don't have control of the committees. Obviously, you lost control of the House. What do you do? How do you react? Or at this point, you just keep advocating, doing programs like this and saying what you think?
Look, we have no choice but to fight because there's one political party, the Democratic Party, which is committed to defending the social safety net, the social contract. And then the other political party is committed to defunding and dismantling the social contract. The Republicans want to cap spending at 2022 levels over the next 10 years, which would lead to severe cuts for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And so our principal role is to protect the social safety net, to protect Social Security from the extremes and excesses of the House Republican majority. But keep in mind that even though the Republicans are in charge, their margins are narrow. It's the narrowest majority in recent memory, which gives us more leverage than you would think.
I want to just pick out two of the items on that list. And one which struck me, which is the origins of the COVID pandemic. Republicans, including Mr. Comer and Mr. Jordan, have asserted that Dr. Anthony Fauci, Mr. Biden's former advisor, covered up a lab leak that they allege may have caused the pandemic. I mean, what are you going to? Is there any basis in fact here that is worth spending the American people's time and money and effort on investigating that? I'm working hard to try and figure it out. I've never seen any evidence of anything like that, other than that's what they allege.
Look, one can imagine an intellectually honest inquiry into the origins of COVID, but I would not expect that from Jim Jordan. What I would expect from Jim Jordan is an endless stream of conspiracy theories about the Biden administration and Anthony Fauci. And again, that is political theater that squanders the resources of the United States Congress and the prestige of the United States Congress.
I guess it's worth, in this dialogue, remembering how often they called the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, to be investigated, and they frankly never really came up with anything other than they still talk about various things. On that note, they talked about investigating the Biden family business. I understand that. How concerned are you about the discovery now of two troves of classified documents, one in President Biden's former office and one now apparently in his home in Wilmington, Delaware? What do you think? Are you concerned? Is this something that raises a flag for you and say, well, wait a minute, we've been challenging Donald Trump over the same thing. Now the Democratic president seems to be guilty on some level of harboring the same documents.
Well, I think we should all be concerned about the mishandling of classified materials, regardless of who's mishandling. Having said that, the issue with Donald Trump was not simply the mishandling of classified material, it was his obstruction of justice. Like, the obstruction of justice is the factor that distinguishes the Trump case from the Biden case. In the case of President Biden, his lawyers discovered these classified materials in Delaware and immediately self-reported those materials to the Department of Justice. So for me, there's no comparison between the obstruction of Donald Trump and the cooperation of President Biden.
Although there is the allegation, I mean, a lot of it's being unveiled now, that they knew about this in November, maybe even prior to the election. And it's one of the things that the former president said, well, wait a minute, why didn't you say this happened before, voters went to the polls? Is that something of concern?
Well, so the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has appointed a special counsel to investigate the controversy surrounding the President Biden's classified materials. So, once the investigation is complete and once the findings are known, I'm going to be in a position to make an informed judgment. But in my view, there's been far more cooperation from President Biden than there ever was from President Trump. What led to the FBI search of his own was not the mishandling of the classified material. It was his obstruction of the investigation, his obstruction of justice.
Let's talk about Representative George Santos. You have had him on your radar. You and colleague Dan Goldman filed an official complaint with the House Ethics Committee requesting that it investigate George Santos, who, it seems quite clear, fabricated much of his resume and many other issues. Just this morning, and by the way, folks, we're recording this on Thursday. The program will air on Monday. You proposed the Santos Act, quote unquote, Santos Act, that amends the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971, would require any candidate for Congress to file additional information about their educational background, military service, and employment history, with a considerable punishment of a $100,000 fine or a year in prison, or both. What do you think? The elected Republicans on Long Island came out and said he should resign. He made it clear that he's not going to resign. Where are we at? What do you think?
Well, George Santos should resign. He has no business serving in the United States Congress because he cannot be trusted to serve the very people he defrauded. I mean, George Santos has lied about nearly every aspect of his life: his family heritage, his employment, his education, his business dealings, his philanthropic endeavors, his ties to historical events like the Holocaust, 9/11, the Pulse mass shooting. The sheer breadth and depth of his deception is staggering. But even worse than his pathological lying is his probable lawbreaking. For me, the million-dollar question is, where did all his money come from? Like a decade ago, he was a wage earner at a Dish call center. As late as 2020, he reported earning a salary of $55,000 a year. And then he subsequently reports earning somewhere between $3.5 to $11.5 million a year. He lent his campaign $700,000 a year. And he claims that he came from the DeVolder organization, which has no public website, no LinkedIn page. He claims to have earned millions of dollars from clients, yet none of the names of his clients have been revealed on his congressional disclosure as required by federal law. And so that's what prompted Dan Goldman and myself to file an ethics complaint with the House Ethics Committee against Mr. Santos for likely falsifying his financial disclosure.
That would seem to be a other than just, well, okay, you said you worked somewhere and you didn't work there, or to say that you were Jewish, and now he says he's Jewish, which is barely funny. That would seem to be a serious offense, so to speak. But Republicans, for their own selfish political reasons, could say, and in many ways they're implying it, we don't want to let him go, because if he does go, it's possible that a Democrat would fill that seat, and then the majority goes from here to here. What happens next? I mean, how do you move the needle on this, or do you hope that just media pressure? I mean, if the Republican leadership doesn't say you got to go, where are we at?
Well, I'm a man on a mission, and I will continue shining a spotlight on the fraudulence of George Santos. And I find it outrageous that the Republicans have defunded the Office of Congressional Ethics at a time when George Santos threatens to corrupt the institution. As you said, there is a tale of two Republican parties. The local Republicans, who are hearing directly from the voters, have called on George Santos to resign, whereas the national Republicans, the House Republican leadership, has been conspicuously silent about the fraudulence of George Santos, because Kevin McCarthy needs every vote that he can get, and for him, George Santos is a vote. His fraudulence be damned. And Elise Stefanik, who's the chair of the Republican conference and a member of the New York delegation, not only enthusiastically endorsed, but fundraised for George Santos in the tune of $100,000. And ever since his lies have come to light, she has said nothing. She has been conspicuously silent, nowhere to be found.
Congressman, we are just about out of time, and we all really appreciate your joining us this evening. What's the next thing you're going to work on, either later today or tomorrow? What are you doing next? And let's be real quick, because we're almost out of time.
So in the previous Congress, I passed legislation known as the United States Fire Administration Act, which establishes the first federal process for investigating the deadliest fires in the country, in the hopes of translating lessons learned into best practices and policies that will save lives. So I want to continue deepening the federal government's role in fire safety so that we can prevent tragedies like the one in Twin Parks Northwest. And we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. Your being able to do this is so important to the people of the Bronx and your constituents. And we appreciate your service and joining us once again on BronxTalk. Thank you so much. Folks, we got to run. We thank our producers, our director, Rebecca and Nick, and the cast of thousands who are here. Next week, the borough president and representatives of her economic team are going to be with us to talk about economic development in the Bronx and small businesses. And we'll see you then. Good night.